Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. Today, I'm joined by Evan Hunter, creator of Elk Nerd. Evan has taken a really interesting approach to elk hunting education. Instead of just relying on personal experience or repeating the same advice we've all heard before, he digs into actual research, GPS collar data, elk behavior, hunting pressure, and the science behind how elk actually use the landscape. Then he takes that information and he turns it into practical strategies that elk hunters can actually use in the field. So today we're going to put Evan on the spot. We're going to play 20 questions. I've got 20 rapid fire elk hunting questions for him. Everything from finding elk and hunting pressure to calling, e-scouting, closing distance, and what the research actually tells us that hunters might be getting wrong. Evan, welcome to Backbone Unlimited.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be on, man. I'm excited to talk about these things, and I've been watching you for a while, so it's an honor to be on here.
Thanks, man. I've seen you on Instagram and YouTube, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation and picking your brain because it's a different side that we get to see a lot of times from just experiential advice. You've actually got science-backed experience, and so that adds another layer to all of this. Let's get going. Evan, you walk into a completely new elk unit tomorrow. What's the very first thing you're going to look for?
I'm looking for steep terrain that I can get to that doesn't have a trailhead at it. I want to get away from people, and people like to go to trailheads, so elk go where people aren't. So I'm looking for areas that are nasty, away from trailheads.
100%. What is the single biggest mistake hunters make when they're trying to find elk?
Not being on time. Not being on time. I think a lot of hunters, especially newer hunters, start glassing and calling way too late in the day. These elk turn nocturnal when they get heavy pressure, especially on over-the-counter general season units. If you're getting there at sunrise, you're too late. So you got to be on time.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be sitting out on a ridge glassing, and all of a sudden, an hour after daylight, we'll see some hunters show up down the ridge, and they've already missed the show. So
Yeah.
absolutely.
And that, that
You
was
know,
me. That was me when I first started hunting too. I'd cover a lot of ground, and I was just doing a bunch of nothing because the elk are bedded by that time. You're not going to see them. So
Absolutely. Yep, yep. And you don't know what you don't know. The mountains are completely silent. What's your first move?
early September, if they're silent, I'm going to get up high and do a lot of glassing, and then morning/midday, I'm going to get into bedding areas and do cold calling sequences to see if I can get one to come in quiet.
Nice. And when you say you're going to get into the bedding areas, are you just going to go marching in there? Or are you going to kind of, hang out on the outskirts of those?
I'm gonna go close. I want to get as close as possible when calling elk, and I do a lot of e-scouting. So I've marked out a bunch of pins where I expect elk to be bedded, or at least a high chance of these elk to be bedded. So I'm looking at north facing / northeast facing slopes, benches within the middle of those slopes where there's lots of canopy cover. And then early season, I like doing a lot of bull calls and raking and sounds of bachelor parties essentially. But I want to get up and close and get them as curious as possible.
Okay. Awesome. Fresh elk sign, but no elk. Stay or move.
That's a tough one. I'm gonna say stay. I'm gonna say stay. If we're talking fresh, like the night before that morning, absolutely. Elk are a rarity, and to be in their vicinity is you've already closed half the battle. So I'm staying there, coming back the next morning.
Excellent. And how long are you going to give it, do you think, before you would move?
A day, a day. I like if I don't see fresh elk sign or see or hear elk, I'm gone the next day. And I may come back in 5 days if it looks like there was old sign or I've been there before and I've seen elk there before. But I'm gonna keep on rotate area, new area till I find elk and then stay on the elk.
Excellent advice. What's one piece of elk sign that you think hunters put way too much confidence in?
Poop, poop. It's when when it's fresh, it's great. But I mean, I've done this myself too, and a lot of my clients do this too. Is you see poop that's a week old, a month old, and it's like, oh, they got to be here. They might not be. I mean, elk move a lot, so unless it's fresh that morning, that previous night, doesn't mean much.
Yeah, excellent. What terrain feature would make you immediately stop and investigate an area if you were just, moving and hunting at the same time?
A terrain feature, a really good glassing point, and B, a saddle where these elk can cross over, especially if that's mixed in with a lot of tracks, a lot of sign. If there's a feeding area somewhere near it and a bedding area somewhere near it, it's going to be a high traffic area where there's going to be a higher chance of being elk.
Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. When your hunting pressure hits, where do mature bulls actually go?
Away from people. They like steep terrain. They like cover. They feel safer when there's more trees around them. They like getting as far away from possible as from roads and trails. And when I say as far as possible, it doesn't mean the backcountry. It doesn't mean 5-10 miles in. That is a good place to go, but a lot of these spots where elk go are right off the road or half mile off the road, but no one wants to go there because there's no immediate access. So, long story short, they go wherever you don't want to go.
Couldn't agree more. And you already answered the next question. How far from roads or trails do hunters really need to get to find pressured elk? And I think that's 100% true. You just need to go as far as they feel secure and safe again.
Yeah, absolutely. And backpack hunting, it sounds great and it sounds really fun. And there's obviously going to be more elk back there, in my opinion. But you're missing out on the mobility of hunting somewhat close to roads and being able to change areas every single day. So there's pros and cons to backpack hunting, and I think you can find elk a lot closer to hunting pressure than you would expect.
Percent. And what is
Yep.
more important when you're e-scouting? Food, water, bedding, or the secure pocket?
It really depends on where you're e-scouting. So I e-scout for a lot of people from different states, and what I say is find the limited resource. For some open areas like New Mexico and parts of Wyoming, that can be bedding, that can be a secure spot because there's only so many north facing slopes with timber on them. If you're hunting somewhere like Oregon or Washington where it's just only timber and it's pretty monotonous and flat, then you're looking for pockets of feed. So I would say it really depends on your area. Find the limited resource. What it generally ends up being for most areas is going to be bedding areas and secure locations.
I feel like a lot of times they prioritize that security and then they make whatever feeding and bedding opportunities that they have available to them work out as long as they feel secure.
Yeah, elk don't need. I mean, they can get a lot of their feed from areas in dark timber. There's a lot of things they can eat. You'd be surprised for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that throws a lot of guys off thinking that they need these big meadows and parks.
That's what you see on YouTube. It's what you see on Instagram, man, and what you see like on these private ranches. So you think that's where the elk are, right in the open meadows, eating on all the grass. So, and sometimes it works out like that. Most times, not so much.
Percent. Couldn't agree more. If you could only mark three things on an elk map before the season, what would they be?
That's a really tough question, a really easy question. 3 routes. And I don't know if that counts as 3, if that's too much, but I would mark 3 routes. I divide my e-scouting up into plans. So I'll have a specific area I want to hunt with feeding areas that I want to target, bedding areas I want to target, and then gets me back to my vehicle. So, and that ends up with a route. So it'll be a morning route and then an evening route, or it could be a full day route where I'm hunting the whole entire day. Um, 3 routes in 3 separate locations. That'd be a really good game plan.
Gotcha. So more focused on the route than any one terrain feature or special need.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, the routes are meant to encompass those things as you're planning the route itself, right? You want to be as specific as possible, but the route is the overarching game plan to make sure you're being efficient in the mountains and not being late and covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. Say you locate a bull at first light. Do you attack immediately or do you prefer to wait for him to bed?
That's tough. If he's close, I'm attacking him. This bull I killed right here, it was right at shooting light, and he was 200 yards away, and I ended up killing him. If he's 400 or 500 yards away or more than that, I'm probably gonna wait till he goes to bedding. I'm still gonna let out some calls on my way to him and see if he wants to come in, because he might. You know, he might come into you. But more than likely, if you're that far away, especially if he has cows, he's going to bedding. And once he's sitting there with his cows and he's territorial and possessive over them, there's no better spot to try to target him in his bed.
It's a tough question because there's so many variables and there are so many follow-up questions that we would need for information, right? And whether you could see the bedding where you think they're going to go bed or, whether they're just going to walk into timber and disappear somewhere. When should an elk hunter stop calling and just start hunting quietly, just still hunting?
I would say a lot of hunters are too quiet and too loud at the same time. A lot of hunters are afraid to call, afraid to locate. Even when the elk are quiet, I'm calling a lot. And they will come in quietly and they have come in quietly. I would say when an elk hunter needs to shut up is when they've already located an elk and they need to close the distance. If they're trying to call an elk in from 500 yards away, it's just not going to happen. I mean, it's unlikely that that will happen, especially if he's already heading towards bedding, especially if he has cows. If he has his own agenda, I would say shut up and then get close and then try to call him in. It's if you're asking more about hunting pressure and that's the spirit of the question, and if hunters call too much in general, I don't think so. I think I think I think with as limited amount of elk as there are out there, I think being aggressive is the way to go, and a high calling volume is generally the way to go.
Bull answers once and then shuts up. What does that tell you?
Um, Depends on the time of day. If he calls once and shuts up, he might have just moved over the ridge, and I might just not hear him anymore. It also just means if he's still there, it may be early season, and he may not be that interested. So what I'm gonna have to do is when I get close, I'm gonna have to build up his interest, possibly with the cow, possibly with injecting another bull into that sequence, but really getting him more fired up and more apt to coming in. It's hard to tell on that one. He may have just gone over the ridge.
What is the biggest mistake you think hunters make when they're closing the final 200 yards on a bull?
Not doing it. A lot of especially the newer hunters that I work with, man, they just don't. They're afraid to get close. They're afraid they're gonna spook the elk. They're afraid they'd rather play it safe. Um, I tend to be on the opposite end of the spectrum where I get too close. I spooked a spike at 30 yards last year because I was trying to get in really close before I called him in. Um, I would say not doing it, not getting close, and when they do get it within 200 yards, not going slow enough. It's kind of like a binary. You want to be aggressive, but you want to do it slowly. And you got to understand you have time. He's bedded. He's likely not going anywhere. You have time to be slow, play the wind.
Think that most elk hunters move too fast or too slow in general as they're hunting, not necessarily responding to a call, but just in general as they're approaching their route, let's say.
Yeah, too slow, too cautious, too afraid of making noise. Yeah, absolutely.
Even as they're just moving around the mountains, not necessarily responding to an elk,
Yeah, especially then.
covering more ground more quickly.
They need to cover more ground quicker. Absolutely.
Okay, got it. So I know you've done a ton of research and connecting the science to elk behavior. What do you think is one piece of elk advice that's running around out there? Could be an old wives' tale, myth, could be something that hunters just take as gospel. What is one elk hunting rule that the research or the GPS data has convinced you is wrong?
Okay, here's a good one. I wouldn't say this is elk behavior, but it's elk hunting related. And I would say using fixed broadheads. And this is going to take a little bit of a turn here, but we do have limited data on what works better on North American ungulates. And it seems to be so far with the data we have that mechanical broadheads actually outperform fixed broadheads. And this is certainly not what I've been told. I've been told you need a tough broadhead that's really sharp, that will penetrate deep. And a lot of that makes sense. But with the limited data we have so far, it seems that fixed broadheads wound elk about twice as much as mechanical broadheads.
Interesting. Interesting.
Very
All right.
interesting. And yeah,
I'm gonna
from what
circle
I've
back on
read,
that in a little bit. That's
absolutely.
interesting. So, what has surprised you most after studying the actual GPS colored elk movement data?
Probably the density of elk and how low it is. A lot of the studies I'm reading, there's one bull per 5 square miles. Or like where I hunt, it's one, after doing the research, one bull per 4 square miles. That sucks. That's horrible. I mean, to try to, and you don't have to cover all that ground, right? Because what you'll find is these elk really condense and densify, if that's a word, based on the pressure. And I want to say based on habitat and terrain, but usually that's sometimes that's not even the case. The habitat itself is only half of the equation. You'll find certain migrational routes that just ignore prime elk habitat, and there's just no elk there. So it's 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 a little overwhelming and what's the word? Disheartening to see how little elk there are in the mountains, but it's also amazing to wanna put in the effort and cover that ground and find those honey holes and do the research and put the work in. So, but there's not as many elk as I realized, or it's much harder to find them than I realized.
I think what's interesting about that is having been on social media and YouTube for a long time, I am sure you've experienced this as well, but you'll have somebody hop on and comment from a place of ego, and they've killed a couple of elk, and they'll say things, like elk hunting is just luck, or elk are just where you find them, or whatnot. But man, I think for the most part, if most people approached it that way, which maybe they do, because our elk success rates are so low across the West. But I just always think in my mind, that if you've had some success, it's going to be limited throughout the course of your life if that's how you approach elk. So I agree 100%. I think that research, amplifies the need for learning elk behavior and understanding terrain and how they use it so that you can increase your odds a little bit at least to try to narrow them down.
Absolutely, absolutely. You need to hunt hard, you need to have a solid strategy and a solid plan. And just thinking you're gonna luck your way into it, it might work every once in a while, but it's not a solid long-term solution.
Absolutely. Evan, what's one thing that elk hunters misunderstand about how elk react to hunting pressure?
They don't quite understand how drastic it is that they react. Like they will go full nocturnal. And I mean, you hear that, oh, the elk are nocturnal, the elk are staying away from the roads. No, it's bad. Like they'll bed before sunrise. And a lot of times they do. So you have to understand that your only chance to get on an elk, if whether he's going to be vocal or just see him during glassing, is like before the sun rises a lot of the time. I mean, all the elk I glassed last year during September, not a single one touched the sunlight. Not a single one. A lot of times they would follow the shadows in, and most were headed to bed before the sun even came up. So it was, it's drastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just makes, again, it just highlights the importance of learning about as much about them as you can, right? Because if you're not going to see them, that's going to really limit a lot of options for folks that are trying to use that as a primary tool.
For sure.
So, based on some of the wound loss research that you've studied, what's the biggest thing that bow hunters could change to recover more elk that, we're talking about elk that have been shot at?
Bow hunter specifically, I would say having the right expectations. I could answer with, the right gear setup or the right broadhead or the right arrow weights. I think a lot of it comes down to expectations. I think a lot of hunters, especially newer hunters, don't understand that they're statistically more likely to wound an elk than they are to recover an elk every time they shoot one. It's the wounding rates are something we need to fix. And I think a lot of my friends, a lot of my hunters that I work with that go into the season, they don't even really consider the option that they might end up wounding an elk, or let alone the fact that it's likely. So I think having the right expectations leads you to care more about practice, leads you to care more about taking the right shot and possibly not shooting the shot that you want to shoot and being selective.
Absolutely. I agree. Couldn't agree more. And one thing that really jumped out to me, we ran 3 in-person elk camps this summer, and we took them up to places where we've called in and killed a lot of elk, and so it was very realistic where they were actually performing these scenarios that we would run through. So we would bring them in on the second day to this area, and we would run calling scenarios all day long, solo and tandem setups, with a
Mm,
caller and a shooter. And my son would be the elk out there calling, and we would run these scenarios just one after another. We would regroup after each one, talk about what went right, what went wrong, and then repeat. And we'd do it all day long. Everybody loved it, right? It was like elk
that's
hunting war
awesome.
games. But the
I want to join.
the
That's cool as
interesting
hell.
oh man, it's amazing. Yeah. And the interesting part about it for me though was even after they got most of the how do I close distance? How do I play this bull to fruition? And they get him into range, just phenomenal how it highlighted we're just out there practicing 99% of the time, just shooting at a foam target or at a target at the range or whatnot. And the kind of practice that we actually need is all those positional, changes that might occur when that elk's actually within range. And even more than that, where he's going to stop in the trees, or trying to get him stopped in between those trees and how narrow some of those shooting lanes are a lot of times. And, they just, they're uncanny about where they choose to stop and the vitals are covered up and then you hold forever and as soon as you let down they take two steps, and then you're exhausted, you got to try to draw again. And I think guys just really underestimate how hard the actual sealing the deal is when the moment of truth comes and he's actually finally in range. And so that's something that I've started to think about a whole lot more and how we can try to recommend that guys get that practice on sealing the deal there. But that's just not something that most guys are practicing.
Yeah, and it's something that's. I mean, you can only practice so much of it, right? You can only make it so real, but because you're not going to have an elk there most time when you are practicing, right? But I think a good question for you would be how can we design some sort of practice regimen or some sort of scheme where you have to have your pack on, you have to get your heart rate elevated, you have to be nervous. It's not a perfect broadside shot, and you get one shot, and that's your shot. And practice scenarios like that where there's only limited shooting lanes. I haven't seen anything like that. I think if we could, as a hunting community, come up with something that would help a lot of people that don't always have access to the mountains, that don't always have access to, being in a realistic scenario. If we can mimic that somehow, at a shooting range, I think that'd be super useful and super valuable to hunters.
Definitely, definitely. Right, at this point, the closest that I can come up with is, stacking some hay bales so that you have a very narrow target where a lot of the animal is covered up, and practicing that hold, and he stopped in the wrong spot, and you're holding for maybe 30, 45 seconds. Most guys are not gonna be accurate at all after that point. You're gonna need to practice letting down quietly, figuring out whether you're going to try to call again, or you're going to try to throw a call behind you, or you're just going to wait for him to step out. How are you going to do that? How are you going to get him stopped again? Maybe you make a call. So, maybe somebody even there with a timer and they time, okay, 30 seconds went by. Now you got to draw again. And being able to draw under fatigue like that, I think is important. Having somebody out there with a camera, even if it's just the phone filming you, adds a lot of pressure to the situation. So, yeah, like you said, anything we can do, elevate the heart rate, exercise first. Always. I mean, the last couple of weeks of season, everybody should have pack on, making sure that they can actually draw their bow, understanding how tight or loose those shoulder straps and whether you use a sternum strap or not, how that needs to be adjusted so that you can shoot under pressure, because you add a little bit of stress and all of a sudden it becomes a lot harder to draw that bow, and then you add a pack on top of that and that compounds the situation. So yeah, I agree, figuring out a way to help guys get more realistic practice is huge.
Yeah, that all that stuff is awesome. And one thing I think, at least that would help me, because it's something I struggle with, is the pressure of time. I don't really get buck fever, but I do feel rifle and bow. Once I get my sights on that animal, that I have a very limited amount of time and I end up rushing my shot. Um, I don't, maybe we could include a timer, or like you have 10 seconds and like, if you can get the shot off in that time, great. If you can't, you have to let down. But I think there'd be some value in adding some sort of time pressure that gets you going.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And this has come up a lot over the last several weeks. Joel Turner's really hammering the shot IQ out there, and we've had folks at Elk Camp that even worked with Joel or have gone through the shot IQ class, and they're telling me, well, it's all about slowing down and waiting and waiting and waiting, and sometimes it's not realistic for what's happening in the field. So part of the
Yeah.
backbone shot process is practicing that, simplifying it in your mind, so your mind gets in the weed less, and being able to get through a solid maybe 4-point shot process where it's the same every single time. We draw, we anchor, we're settling that pin where it needs to go. You've already thought through where your exit's going to be, so you don't have to sit there and analyze for 10 more seconds while you're doing it, but it's just drawing, anchoring, pin, pull through, and that arrow's away. So it's a matter of seconds versus sitting there and getting shook up about it and having to think through a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. Evan, we're going to get close to the end here. So when we look at all this knowledge that you've accumulated, what is one piece of advice you'd have for somebody trying to kill their first public land bull this September?
This is going to be more practical advice than data advice, but don't quit. Hunt every day you say you're gonna hunt. Um, s- it's rare I talk to a hunter that hunted last year, and I worked with him, and he didn't quit early last year. It's going to be tough. You're going to hate it when you're out there. You're going to be tired. You're not going to see a lot of bulls. You're going to see a lot of hunters. It's going to be very demoralizing. But every day you spend out in the mountains is days that you're learning, and you're trying to better yourself not just for this coming year and kill a bull this year, but every year following that. So if you can make it a goal, your primary goal, just to not quit, A, you're going to make your chances a lot better at actually killing an elk, and B, you're going to learn for the following years.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, all about the learning, and the more at bats that you have, the more you're going to learn it, and you're going to cut down that learning curve. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right, Evan, let's wrap it up. And as we do, I'd love to hear about any other projects that you're working on that folks should know about.
Yeah, so the big one I'm pushing right now is I'm running an observational study called the Herd. We're testing two big things, well, three really big things, but the two main ones we're testing is for archery, we're testing mechanical versus fixed broadheads. And on the other end of the spectrum, we're testing for rifles, big versus small cartridges. And the way it works is we're trying to recruit a bunch of hunters that are willing to go out and hunt elk just like they normally would. And when they make a shot attempt, they just mark a pin in Onyx, put down a few structured notes, including if they recovered the elk, what kind of broadhead they were using, the arrow weight, their draw weight, things like that. And then at the end of the season, they send it to me. I process it, run a bunch of algorithms on it, and then we can have, for the first time, actual data on better gear to use for elk, whether that be fixed broadheads, whether that be mechanical broadheads, and seeing how these recovery rates change with heavier and lighter arrow weights. And we're also including experience and practice each year as a variable too when you sign up for the study too. So we'll be able to see how much does practice affect recovery rate? Is it more than a broadhead could change recovery rates? And we'll be able to compare and look at different variables and be better and more efficient hunters out in the field.
Awesome. I love it. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you about that or anything else elk hunting related, how should they do that?
If you want to sign up for the study, go to my Patreon. It's just patreon.com/elk_nerd. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. That's probably the best way.
I will put those links to both Evan's project through Patreon and his Instagram in the show notes. So check those out, both for the audio version of this and on YouTube. Evan, I can't thank you enough for hopping on. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I hope guys take advantage of it. Listen to the advice you've given here, and reach out to you if they have any other questions about elk hunting.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you, man. It's been an honor being on here.